Good afternoon and welcome to another installment of WARF's Entrepreneurons program. My name is Laura Heisler. I am Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, which is delighted to bring you this series in partnership with UW-Madison's Discovery to Products Office, or D2P. Today's program is a bit of a prelude to an exciting week of programs at UW-Madison for UW-Madison Startup Week. And there are a number, if you could switch to that slide, UW-Madison Startup Week. There are a number of programs being featured beginning Wednesday, November 11th. To see all of them, go to innovate.wisc.edu. WARF is featuring a program each day of this week. If you could go to the next slide. Beginning on Wednesday, November 11th, we'll have another installment of Entrepreneurons at our more typical time of 4 p.m. Getting things going with exploring your business idea using the Business Model Canvas Toolbox. We're going to have another program on November 12th, again through Entrepreneurons, looking at venture funding in the tech community, especially with how things have changed post-COVID. On November 13th, I want to call your attention to a different start time, 2 p.m. like today, through our WARF Essential Topics series, focusing on how UW-Madison inventors can get started working with WARF to protect their intellectual property and get that whole technology commercialization process going. We're taking a break over the weekend, and then we're right back at it on Monday, November 16th, again at 4 p.m. with our WARF Essential Topics series, looking at the kinds of things that arise for a number of UW-Madison faculty, students, and staff on navigating consulting agreements, conflicts of interest, and so on. We'll continue on November 17th with a really interesting look at programs around the country that could be good models for the UW-Madison community to bring more women and people of color into entrepreneurship programs and to be more supportive of their interests and their considerations. And then, of course, we end with a big bang on November 18th with WARF Innovation Day, again, beginning at 2 p.m. If you could go to the next slide, we provide a place that you can send a note if you'd like to get emails about any of these events, or you can simply go to warf.org to see the events as listed and sign up right there. So with that, I want to mention a couple of housekeeping notes for today's session. As always, we encourage you to use the Q&A function. It's very important that we get questions. We really want this to be of value to you. So you are welcome to ask questions using the Q&A function, which you find at the bottom of your screen. You post your question at any time. We will make sure towards the end of the hour to have an opportunity to field as many of your questions as possible. So please bring those questions through the Q&A function, and we'll be taking a look throughout the session. With that, I am delighted to turn the virtual podium over to my colleague, Greg Keenan, who is a senior director in WARF's Venture Office. Greg, it's all yours.
Thank you, Laura. And I look forward to a great week of discussions as part of Startup Week. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today to learn more about Varsity Venture Studio, which is an initiative WARF is launching in partnership with UW-Madison and High Alpha Innovation. As Laura said, my name is Greg Keenan, and I'm a senior director here in WARF's Venture Office. And I'm really excited to introduce you to Elliot Parker, who we've had the great fortune to know for at least a year now. And Elliot will talk to us about venture studios as an emerging model for innovation. However, before I turn it over to Elliot, I wanted to provide WARF's perspective on venture studios. As many of you know, for actually 95 years, WARF has established a strong track record in securing and licensing intellectual property from UW-Madison's campus. These inventions range from life-saving therapeutics to microprocessors on our phones to improvements in food crops. And revenue from this decades of patent and licensing activity have created the endowment that we use to support the amazing research that goes on at this campus. However, not all innovations fit the traditional patent and licensing model that has really been WARF's bread and butter for decades. This is particularly the case with software. In order to better support software innovations on campus, we realized we need to develop new models of commercialization. And one really promising model that we've been investigating for at least 2 years now is this model of venture studios. Many of you may be familiar or have heard of venture studios. Certainly many startup communities around the country are deploying this model. For example, Pioneer Square Labs in Seattle, High Alpha in Indianapolis, Titletown Tech up in Green Bay, and even Generator here in Madison and Milwaukee are running studio cohorts. And of course, corporations are also viewing studios as a way to advance innovations inside their own businesses. So right here in town, AmFam runs a studio here on the Near East Side. Northwestern Mutual runs a studio in Milwaukee, and corporate global corporates like SAP, Google, Amazon have studios as well. Like these communities and corporations, we know there are a lot of problems and technologies on our campus that can be solved or enabled by software. Unfortunately, many of these ideas on our campus, these software-related ideas, don't see the light of day because we lack the execution experience and resources to effectively move them to market. That's where we think a venture studio can come in and help. The venture studio brings resources that can help us fill that execution gap. And I want to be clear, the venture studio is merely one path. It may not be for everyone, for every innovation or every invention on campus, but it is a very promising model for many. It also does not compete or replace the many resources we already have on campus. Rather, it's a complementary resource. And in many ways, I think that the Venture Studio will have a multiplier effect when combined with programs like D2P, the Mortgage Entrepreneurial Bootcamp, and the recently launched Creative Destruction Lab initiative, which is a partnership with CEDIS, the School of Business, and AmFam. So we really think this Venture Studio works well and fills some gaps that we currently have in our ecosystem. And make no mistake about it, I want to be very clear, the goal of the studio is to launch scalable and venture-backable companies off our campus. If the studio isn't spinning out companies, it will not be successful. It really is dependent on the success of those companies and the financial returns those companies could generate to keep the studio running. So the way, what we think is really promising is the kind of ticket to entry is an idea. And when you look at the ideas per square foot on a university campus, there are many, many, many. It's a rich source of opportunities for a venture studio. And so what we're going to be doing is combining that amazing idea generation capacity on our campus with the process and execution resources a venture studio can provide. So with that, I'm going to introduce Elliot Parker, and Elliot is going to talk to us more about the venture studio model. High Alpha Innovation in Indianapolis is one of the leading firms in the space and has a remarkable track record in spinning software companies out in the Indianapolis area. And if you get a chance and you're in Indianapolis, it's amazing the impact that High Alpha has had in the Indianapolis ecosystem. It really is just a remarkable story and one we're so excited to be part of now. So Elliot is the CEO of High Alpha Innovation. He has spent his career in innovation, which includes stints in startups, corporate innovation, and in business strategy consulting. Prior to joining High Alpha, Elliot was a principal at Innosight. And for those that don't know Innosight, that was the consulting firm that Clayton Christensen founded. So that's obviously a very exciting pedigree to have, and is certainly a great person to work for in the innovation space. And prior to Innosight, Elliot co-founded a consulting firm, Innovo Partners, and worked in corporate ventures at Roche. And I think he even had some licensing experience as well. So welcome, Elliot. I'll turn it over to you now to introduce us to the studio model.
Thanks, Greg. Nice to be here, and welcome to everyone who joined us. I look forward to the day when we can do these in person again, and we can do all this face to face and see each other. But I'm happy to be here today, excited to talk about the venture studio model. What we're going to do today is talk about what a venture studio is, and then what we've learned about running a venture studio in the 5 years that we've been doing this at High Alpha. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here and put this on play. So before we jump in and talk about venture studios in more detail, I want to tell you a story. It wasn't long ago that I was a student myself, and this is not a comparison of entrepreneurship to a march into Mordor or anything like that. But I started a company, my first year of business school several years ago, around the time that Lord of the Rings, one of the Lord of the Rings movies came out. And it's relevant to the business. Hold on just a second, I'll tell you why. I started business school. A few friends and I kind of quickly identified other people who had an entrepreneurial bent and found 3 friends. And we decided first year of business school, we were going to launch a company together. And so I pulled these three friends into a room, and we said, we're not going to leave this room until we decide which business we're going to start. I had a list of about 125 business ideas at the time that I'd been keeping. And we decided in that room, narrowed it down to a few, and then ultimately picked one. We decided we were going to build a national chain of retail kiosks in movie theater lobbies. This was our idea. We thought, boy, you can go to a sporting event, you can buy a hat or a t-shirt on the way out. You go to a rock concert, you can buy a t-shirt. Why can't you do the same thing when you go to the movies? Tons of merchandise is sold related to movies. If we could put that merchandise in the theater lobbies where there seems to be lots of space, when people are at that emotional high coming out of a movie, we could become gazillionaires selling this stuff. And so we decided to launch the business. And we went out and negotiated a test run with a local movie theater chain. This is in Los Angeles, and ran an experimental weekend, which went extraordinarily well. It was the launch of a movie, the Incredible Hulk movie. We had these foam Hulk hands that we bought to sell in the movie theater lobby, and couldn't keep them on hand. Pretty quickly, over the course of the weekend, team was running down to Walmart, buying them and bringing them back to the movie theater, marking them up and selling them. And we thought, we're onto something. This is going to work. So we signed up to do it at multiple locations with this movie theater chain, and we were in business. We then had to get our inventory. We didn't have any funding for this. So, and we had no idea what we were doing when it came to retailing. So we had to learn a lot on the fly. We went out and bought about $125,000 worth of inventory, everything from video games to stuffed animals to t-shirts to books related to the movies that were coming out that summer. We paid for it all with credit cards. And we got this inventory in, started coming in. We stored it at a public storage facility and went out and hired a few dozen employees and opened up these kiosks and waited to see what happened. And it was interesting during first year of business school, driving around Los Angeles area, picking up cash at 2 a.m. from movie theaters while getting ready for class the next day. It's quite an experience. Looking back, there were some things that we did right. We ran some experiments before we went all in, but there were a lot more things we did wrong. I would not recommend funding a business with credit cards, for one. A lot of things that we just didn't know. We were learning on the fly. Now, fortunately, we were lucky and got our money back, and that business still exists in a form, very different model now, but close to 20 years later, is still around, which is I'll count as a win. But looking back, there are so many things I would have done differently had I known. I just didn't know. I was learning with my friends on the fly as we were doing this. Nothing had prepared us for this. There was no place to go to get easy help. And as a result, we kind of fumbled our way through it when it could have been done much better. And this is true of so many entrepreneurs out starting businesses. One of the things we see in the country right now is that there are not as many startups being created as we would expect or as we would hope. We're actually seeing a decline in the number of new businesses started. It's very hard to start a company. It's very hard to start a venture backable startup in particular. And I think if we could make it easier for people to do this, everybody would benefit. Now, let me tell you another kind of movie-related story of a sort. About 120 years ago, movie studios started being formed. So as the movie industry was getting created, people quickly realized that they could make movies more efficiently if they built studios to create the films. And what that meant was, instead of forming a single company to launch a single movie where you'd have to go hire a scriptwriter and actors and someone to operate the camera and so on, people realized a lot of the fundamental activity in creating movies is repeated. It's repeatable and could be done at scale. You could get experts who are very good at operating a camera, and you could get experts who are very good at writing a script, and you could bring these people in-house and employ them in a studio, and you could crank out movies in a systematic way, and you could get better at assessing which of these movies are most likely to succeed as well. And so the movie studio was born as a way to create movies systematically. Well, similarly, over the last few decades in particular, we've learned a lot about how to create and fund venture backable startups. And by that, I mean startups that have the potential to reach massive scale and produce very good outsized returns for investors. We've learned a lot about how to create these companies, how to fund these companies, and how to scale them once they get started. It makes sense that we would be applying now a similar model to what was figured out in the movie industry 100 years ago. Why not build studios where you can have the experts on staff who get very good at building and launching companies in a systematic way? And that, in a nutshell, is what a venture studio is. It's like a movie studio, but for companies, creates companies systematically. And for us, you might have heard the term startup studio, venture studio, company builder, a lot of these terms going around. For us, a venture studio has a very specific meaning. And that is the combination of a build function plus a source of capital. So in the build function, you have a team of experienced company builders who conceive of, who design, and who launch startups. And then you marry that with a source of capital, often in the form of a venture fund that can be dedicated and invested in the startups the studio creates, as well as sometimes other existing startups out in the wild. The build function plus a source of capital is what we define as a venture studio. And this is in contrast to, for example, a startup studio or company builder that might not have the source of capital attached to it. How is a venture studio different from other models out there? In some ways, a venture studio is a throwback to the early days of venture capital. When venture capital first started, investors back in the 70s, for example, would often roll up their sleeves and get busy helping the companies that they invested in. So they'd put the capital to work, and then they'd also get busy working themselves. So in many ways, venture studios is a nod to that those early days of venture capital. If you think about it, here on this 2x2, you've got capital and support on the axes. A venture studio is all in terms of both capital invested in the startups it creates, as well as the support that it provides to those startups. Versus a venture fund that is investing capital, but providing pretty light support, or an accelerator that might be providing pretty extensive support or coaching to a team, but maybe not a lot of capital. We've got some friends at a venture studio in Dubai called Enhanced Ventures that track the number of venture studios, the venture studios being created around the world. At last count, I believe there were over 560 venture studios that have formed, most of them in just the last few years. When we, I'll tell you more about High Alpha in a minute, but when we launched 5 years ago, nobody was using the term, as far as we know, venture studio at that time. Now, the model wasn't brand new. Idea Lab, as an example, had been around since, I believe, 1997 with a version of a venture studio model. But just in the last few years, we've seen an explosion of the approach. And we've seen some recent pretty significant success stories, the Snowflake IPO being a recent example of that. One of the most successful software company IPOs in history. And this was a business that was incubated inside of a venture fund. Not specifically a venture studio, but in effect, a venture studio model, where you had the investors incubating, building, and scaling the company within their fund. So this is a model that is popping up all over the world. We expect to see more and more of it over the next few years. It's important to note that this model is also very, very hard to execute successfully. And we've learned a lot over the last 5 years about what separates the venture studios that are working from those that don't. A couple of years ago, we formed a group called the Venture Studio Collective, where we went out and we pulled together the top venture studios in the world, about a dozen of them that we felt are doing a good job, where they are investing in companies, launching companies, and generating a track record of success with those businesses. And we tried to identify what do these have in common that is propelling them to success. And what you see here are the primary components. Venture studios that are successful have a dedicated source of capital. They have an ecosystem and network, meaning they have access to the talent they need to run the businesses that they launch, as well as a broader network of investors and other people participating in helping to launch, to source ideas, to launch those ideas as businesses, and to see them get scaled successfully. Successful venture studios have very well-defined systems and processes, and I'll talk more about what that means in just a moment. But in a nutshell, we find that venture studios that succeed have forcing functions in place ways that they've put in methods or tools or processes that they've put in place to force themselves to launch new companies. It is very hard to launch companies. It's very easy not to launch companies. We have lots of ideas for new businesses all the time. Even for the best of those ideas, there are 1,000 reasons why we should stop and not proceed, and maybe only a handful of reasons why we should continue. You have to put in place forcing functions that help you to overcome some of your biases and move forward toward launch. Successful venture studios have the right mix of structure and incentives in place, meaning there are outcomes that are achievable for the entrepreneurs involved in those venture studios that incentivizes them to participate, to go build companies, and to work with the studios to do that. Successful studios have experienced teams who know how to launch companies, who have launched businesses before, who have taken those companies ideally to scale. And then finally, the venture studios that are successful have a pretty clear domain focus. For us, historically at High Alpha, that's been B2B SaaS or business-to-business software. Every venture studio that's successful has a defined focus that keeps them grounded. So High Alpha has been around since April 2015 and is comprised of three pieces. There's the studio, which is now about 40 people who build new B2B SaaS companies. High Alpha, in our studio now, we're launching a new startup. This year, I think in 2020, we'll end up launching 12 companies this year. So about every 4 or 5 weeks. High Alpha Capital is our venture fund that we, again, our source of capital that we deploy in our studio companies, as well as existing startups out in the wild that we invest in as venture capitalists. And then finally, High Alpha Innovation, which I run, which is our team of expert business builders who partner with other organizations like the University of Wisconsin to make the studio model accessible as a way to drive systematic startup creation and innovation. So we're based in Indianapolis, come pretty good pedigree. The B2B software background comes from our DNA, which came out of a company called ExactTarget that was based in Indianapolis, built here, and ultimately sold to Salesforce in 2014. My friends who founded High Alpha in 2015, prior to forming High Alpha, had about $3 billion in exits of software companies. So we've got experience in conceiving of starting and scaling businesses. We've got some of the leading venture capitalists on our team as investors and on our board supporting us, Brad Feld from Foundry Group and Gordon Ritter from Emergence Capital in particular, who are very supportive. I mentioned that we've over the last couple of years have played this role of convener, bringing together some of the top venture studios around the world as a way to learn from each other as we all figure out this model. And then finally, one of the things that makes us somewhat unique from other venture studios is that we began as a kind of a pure venture studio, go launch startups. Over time, have partnered more and more with other corporations and organizations to make the studio model accessible as a way to, as I mentioned, to drive innovation and systematic startup creation. We find there's a lot of merit in teaming up, in particular with corporations, to build software startups that solve problems they or their customers have, as a way to get those startups to scale faster than they otherwise would on their own through that relationship with the corporation. This shows you an example of it shows you the portfolio of companies that we've built out of our studio. We've launched now 27 companies in total out of our venture studio. We've invested in another 30 or so, and are getting ready to launch Fund 3 here soon. So getting ready to do another round of new launches in 2021. Some of these names you may recognize. I'll tell stories of a couple of them in just a bit. One of the things that gets me excited about the venture studio model, Greg alluded to this, is the impact it can have on a community. And in Indianapolis, there's been a tremendous impact on the community, I would say. So of the 27 companies that we've launched, they've been all over the country, but predominantly in the Indianapolis area. Those businesses have gone on to hire over 700 people so far. What gets me excited about that is those are 700 people who are all learning how to build and launch their own venture-backed startups. So this is a cycle that a virtuous cycle that we hope will have ramifications for decades in the area. These companies that we've launched have gone on to raise $150 million or more in venture capital, which is a metric that we use to determine how well we're doing. It's a metric by which we determine some degree of validation from outside investors. This is a map. You'll see that we've launched companies now or invested in companies all over the country, even internationally if you count our investment in Toronto. So we've been all over the country and look forward to launching some businesses in Wisconsin. Now, back to this idea of how a venture studio actually functions and works, this idea of forcing functions in a venture studio. This has been the key to our success and the ability to launch a new startup every 4 to 5 weeks. It begins with an ideation process where we source the ideas. Those ideas in our studio can come from a number of different sources: corporate partners, other venture investors, our own ideas that we come up with on our own, or entrepreneurs coming to us with an early stage idea where they say, I want to team up with a venture studio as a way to get this business to scale faster than I could perhaps on my own. We'll take that initial set of ideas, run them through a period of exploration where we go investigate the opportunity with customers and winnow that initial set of ideas down to a set that we believe have a lot of merit and could be launchable. All that activity culminates in a sprint week. Now, in our core venture studio, we run a sprint week once a quarter. We take anywhere from 3 to 5 ideas, 3 to 6 ideas through this sprint week that ends with an informed, confident go, no-go launch decision. We decide at the end of the week whether to launch those ideas as a new business. Now, we call sprint week our primary forcing function because each time we run a sprint week, we tell ourselves that we are going to launch at least one of those ideas as a new business at the end of the week. And that drives everything then that happens before it. That means those ideas 3 months prior to the sprint week that we begin the cycle with better be pretty good. It means the ideas that we refine in the initial set better be very, very good. And the 4 or 5 ideas that we take to sprint week better be excellent. We better be able to believe that any of those could be launchable because we need at least one of those to be launchable. This is not pretend. This is not theater. At the end of the week, we are going to make an investment and launch a new business. Now, what's interesting about the venture studio model, I'll talk about this in a moment. You think about our activity overall, maybe 10% of the activity is focused on that ideation through sprint week. 90% of the activity in the venture studio comes after launch. It's all the support provided to the entrepreneurs, to the co-founders that we build that business with as we're trying to get that company to scale. You imagine having a portfolio of 27 companies, early stage startups that we're working with. It's a tremendous amount of activity. So a sprint week, as I mentioned, kind of a unique thing to our model. It is full immersion for a week. We like to say that over the course of 4 days, we compress the first 6 months of a business into those 4 days so that we can learn as much as we can and make a good, informed go, no-go launch decision at the end of the week. The goal is at the end of the week to have a business that is ready to launch, where we can look at that objectively as investors, put capital into the business and launch it with a team of co-founders ready to work with us to get that business to scale. So it is intense because we know at the end of the week, we're putting real money and time and reputation on the line to make that happen. So then following the launch of the new business, the studio supports these companies in a number of different ways. In brief, what I would say is that when we launch a business, we do everything we can to make sure that company succeeds. Sometimes that means hopping on a plane to help close a sales deal with their CEO. We'll do that. But if you think about the major groupings of activities, you've got back office support. So think about the finance, HR, setting up payroll, dealing with the attorneys, figuring out the space and the lease, all these types of activities that are necessary in a business, but ultimately are a distraction to the CEO building a big scale business. The fundamental thesis behind a venture studio is that we want our CEOs focused on understanding their customer and building a killer product. And then the studio should be able to do most of the rest. So that can mean product development, it can mean help with fundraising, it can mean help with design, the marketing and PR, whatever it takes to make that business successful. Over time, studio support scales back as these businesses go out and get external funding from other investors. Again, as a way to validate those models, but as a way to price those companies, as a way to become more independent. The studio support gradually scales back, where by the time one of our portfolio companies gets to a Series A, the studio is no longer actively supporting that company in the way that you see here. Still perhaps on the board, still coaching, mentoring, still participating in the network of companies and all the support that comes from that, but not actively doing the building the website anymore, for example. So I'll tell you a brief story just to bring this to life. Bolster is a company that we launched publicly just a couple of months ago. This is an idea that started with a collaboration between High Alpha Innovation and Silicon Valley Bank, where we were looking at ways to support the broader venture community. Silicon Valley Bank is a bank that's dominant in the space of venture-backed startups and venture funds. For them to grow strategically, they need the ecosystem to be stronger. And so we are looking for ways to support that ecosystem. Identified a need with a lot of venture-backed startups where they don't have access to fractional talent, either at the executive level or the board level, that could help them get to the next stage. And so we decided to build a marketplace that would bring these startups and executive level fractional talent together and form that in a company called Bolster. So we conceived of the idea, took it through a sprint week, shaped the business, designed the business, and then found a wonderful founding team, a CEO, and some other founders to come run the business. That CEO and other founders invited other investors to participate in the deal. So USV and Costanoa came in and co-invested alongside High Alpha and Silicon Valley Bank in that new business, which we launched publicly just a month or two ago. You can check it out at bolster.com. So this is an example of a recent company that we launched out of the studio that came out of an initial collaboration where we looked at a kind of a broad empty space, generated an idea and turned it into a business within a few months. So I'm going to show, just to wrap up, last thing in the presentation here, and then we'll get to the Q&A. I'm going to show a brief video from one of our studio company CEOs explaining the model of the venture studio and what it's like for him as a CEO working with a venture studio. We'll see if the audio and video work here as they should. And that did not. Let's try that again. There we go.
It's been fascinating to see the rise of customer success. In just a decade, we have an entire new function in every SaaS company on the planet to focus on customers being successful. Every B2B SaaS company still struggles to have the visibility they want into renewals. We believe we need to redesign and rethink how we manage customers if you're a digital-first B2B SaaS company. And at MetaCX, we've built a new framework that rethinks the idea of customer success and customer management for a digital-first company. The High Alpha model is fascinating. It's this venture fund to invest in innovative companies with the engine to actually create the companies it invests in. And being now part of the studio and benefiting from this platform, you have finance, HR, recruiting, the ability that gave us to focus on our actual early product and customers. I'm not even sure how to measure it. On the finance side, we need to keep careful track of how we're executing and just to have that expertise at a level that really we wouldn't have prioritized as a early company. It helps all of us think bigger, execute more aggressively. It makes our investors feel more comfortable. If we add all that up, it translates to speed. It just lets us go far faster than we could on our own. I can say this, I will never do it another way. The whole idea of starting a company from scratch and having to deal with all that from the beginning as a founder, why in the world would you do that if you can have the leverage and foundation that comes from High Alpha Studio in our case? It's terrific.
All right, so I'll end the screen share there. That was the end of the presentation. Let me just reiterate what Scott McCorkle said there, just to summarize and bring this home. The goal of a venture studio is to enable entrepreneurs to generate more value faster than they could on their own. That's the goal. And Scott there mentioned this idea of speed. Scott is a very successful entrepreneur, former CEO of Salesforce Marketing Cloud, in addition to successfully launching and advising lots and lots of startups over the years. Doing this with High Alpha with a venture studio is a way to, as a serial founder himself, a way to get to scale, bigger scale, faster than he could on his own. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do with Varsity Venture Studio too. That's the goal, and happy to answer questions about the model and what we're hoping to do. Greg's unmuted, and we'll turn it back over and let you hear.
Ready to go. Thanks, Elliot. We've had, if you have questions, please submit them. We're getting quite a few. We'll be addressing those in just a couple of minutes. Before we do that, I want to introduce one other of my colleagues here on this event. Some of you may know him from campus, but I want to introduce you to Kieran Furlong, who is an innovation mentor and really just an invaluable resource at discovery to product on the UW-Madison campus. Kieran has a career that spans startup. We actually work together at Virant on the far west side of Madison. So we have a rather long history together and have been in the trenches. And so I'm so appreciative that Kieran came back to Madison and is helping us on campus with innovation. He's also worked in venture capital and corporate innovation as well. And given his role on campus and his decades of innovation experience, I wanted Kieran to provide his thoughts from a campus perspective on Varsity Venture Studio. And I also want to ask him, because we had a question on impact. And as part of his comments, I'm asking him to comment on both the impact this can have on campus, but what about statewide impact as well? And then Elliot, after he's done there, that's going to be the first question for you as well.
Very good. Thanks, Greg. Can you hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up to make sure. Yeah, excellent. So really, everyone, yeah, great to have you along this afternoon. What Greg meant to say was it's his fault that I'm on campus once again. But first of all, one of the things I wanted to say is a big thank you to WARF for taking this calculated risk and initiating the Varsity Venture Studio. And also, it's great to see a tech transfer office trying something new, to fit into the world of 21st century tech transfer. This is a real challenge right now for technology transfer offices, as the traditional model of, hey, let's take that great campus technology, license it to, said large company, and we'll collect future royalties when they begin to sell it and so on. And what you see, of course, in the 21st century and more tech transfer, and how technology is acquired by large companies, the likes of Google and Facebook and so on, is through acquisition, often acquisition of startups and so on as well. So I think, kudos to Greg and Katie and the team at WARF for trying something new, and great to have, Elliot and the team coming on board to do this as well. One of the things is, for those who've been around startups for a long time, Elliot, you mentioned the formula, and there's a number of things, a number of ingredients that are needed, but some of the ones that you may want to, kind of highlight in startup world are, one is the idea. Okay. And that's something that UW-Madison has got no shortage of, right? So that's one of the great things to have here on campus. Now, there's definitely some whittling down when you're trying to look for that idea that's going to be able to become a scalable business, one that's going to attract venture capital and so on. But ideas, we tick that box at UW-Madison, I'm pretty sure of that. When I first came to the Midwest, to Madison, and actually was working with Greg at the UW spinout, actually called Virant, there was lots of hand-wringing around capital and venture capital and the lack of investors and dollars from the coast finding opportunities in the Midwest. And I think that is being tackled, it continues to be tackled. It's not the problem it potentially once was, but I think even back then it may have been oversold. But since then, we've seen things like the Badger Fund of Funds, for example, locally, and their Scion funds are very active in supporting Wisconsin-based startups. So we've got more local capital to draw on, and capital is closer to the coalface. But then also we're finding ways to draw the attention of venture capital further afield as well. So one example of that is the Scout Camp, which UW-Madison is participating in, and that's essentially it's a made for pandemic times event where it's speed dating via Zoom with investors and the tech transfer offices and new technologies. So capital, I think, is being addressed as well. And then there's know-how, right? So how do folks actually get around to building businesses? And that's our role, I would say, a big part of it at Discovery to Product, which, there's folks like me, we've got mentors who've come from outside the university, from industry who are bringing some expertise and can help pass that along. And we're using tried and tested methods like the NSF PsyCore program to guide how we look at ideas. And I think there was one question there around how ideas are vetted and filtered. That's something that we definitely look at. We talk about product market fit, but I think Elliot may have some comments on the process that's used by the studio as well. So there's that know-how, and it's not just Discovery to Product. We've got a large ecosystem now in the Madison area, both on campus and off. You've got Generator running their G-Beta program and so on. You've now got the Creative Discretion Labs risk program as well. So we've got a lot of that know-how, kind of at least trying to impart the know-how. But one thing that's really, really hard to, because it's just, you just, kind of come up with it out of thin air, is experience. And Greg, you mentioned the execution experience. And I think that's what's going to be a difference here with the studio, but also the coordination, because you can have all of these various ingredients, but as any chef out there knows, if you add the ingredients in the wrong order or don't have enough or all in the right place, nothing's going to happen. And I think coordinating those together is something that that we're going to be able to do at Varsity Venture Studio. I thought the movie studio analogy is a really great way to think about it. You're going to have people who just they know the formula, they've done it before, and they're going to try and do it again. So that's, I think, how I see it fitting in alongside all of the other activities that are already happening here at UW-Madison, in the greater Madison region, and also across the state in Wisconsin. In terms of the impact, Greg, so here's another way to really, kind of juice some of the startup ideas that are already happening, that we're already working with, for example, at D2P. And it's a way to get them out across that first valley of death. You'll hear that hackneyed phrase so many times, but, and it's not just one. There's so many times when a startup idea has to make that leap. And with the studio, there's going to be a possibility to have the support from experienced people who here's how it's done. You've got the capital there as well for the ideas that are selected and can successfully be formed into a company. And that's another kind of obstacle taken away. And they're all happening together at the same time. So I think one of the impact is we are going to see an increased number of spin-outs from UW-Madison. And that's definitely something that we want to see. It in turn contributes to the state's economy, to job creation and all the rest of it. It also contributes to the reputation of both the university and the state as well. In fact, Ken Johnson, who is involved with the Badger Fund of Funds I mentioned earlier, has often talked about, Wisconsin's ranking in some of these areas. And I think this is another way where we can build on the reputation of getting startups out there. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be limited just to UW-Madison, the Madison area and so on as well. You're trying a new model here. Elliot kind of said it's already spread. There's a number of these places around the world, but it's still relatively recent, but it kind of makes sense. It's doing a lot of what successful accelerators were doing. It's doing a lot of what successful incubators were doing. It's doing a lot of what venture capital firms who have the kind of company build mode were already doing, but maybe on a more ad hoc basis. And it's bringing those together. So I think we will see an impact from that perspective as well. And I think it's funny, right? Because everyone will talk about, Boston, the Silicon Valley, and other parts around the country. It takes decades to get to that kind of position, right? That kind of reputation. And it will take Wisconsin a long time as well. But we're not going to get there if we don't start. I think there's been some great work done already. Since the difference when I first moved to Madison in 2011, if I remember correctly, to now, it's hugely different already. So kudos to all in the ecosystem who have been working hard on that. And this, I think, is just going to be one more addition that hopefully will escape into orbit with a few more companies.
Awesome.
Stop right
Thanks.
there.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. So Elliot, can you just quickly comment on impact? Because I know in Indianapolis, you all had a remarkable impact in that city and that ecosystem. So can you just comment on what you expect the impact could be from an initiative like this tied to a university like UW-Madison?
Yeah, the goal is to create reverberations that last for a long, long time in a positive way. I mentioned in Indianapolis in particular, we've launched 27 companies, most of which are in the Indy area, not all. Those companies are employing over 700 people now. And that's a lot of people learning about how to, the ins and outs of launching their own venture-backed startup one day. I anticipate that we will see many, many more companies created out of even the initial wave, whether they're successful or not, and we hope they will be. So far, so good. We'll see many, many more companies created over time, and the impact will last for a long, long time. So our hope is that we'd see a similar impact in the UW-Madison community, both in Madison itself, associated with the university and with the alumni base. This drives reverberations in terms of new companies getting launched for a long time.
Well, certainly it's, the ideas may be sourced from the UW-Madison campus for this current year's activity. There's certainly opportunities for support personnel, experienced people in our community to perhaps help one of the companies that gets shortlisted. Certainly opportunities for our investors in our ecosystem to participate as well when the company gets launched. So Kieran, so what we decided to do in this Q&A is that Kieran and I would gang up on Elliot. So we're gonna share picking some of the questions out of here to start grilling you. So go ahead, Kieran, you're up.
All right, and I think what we'll try and do, and to address the audience questions, I want to make sure we get all of those as well, but just to go through the ideation, or ideas first, then we're choosing from ideas, and then you're building on those ideas, so we can kind of walk through those. But let's just give us, your very short summary, Elliot, of what kind of ideas are we looking for?
Good ones, and lots of them. No, we're looking at, first, how do you define an idea? An idea might be something as simple as a problem that you've identified. Here's a problem that exists in the world I don't see a good solution for. That can be a starting point. Submit that. That's a good place to start. On the other end of the extreme, it might be something you've already developed, started working on as a business and taken out and prototyped in the market. Maybe you even have an initial customer doing some beta testing. That would equally qualify as an idea. So we're looking essentially for, at this stage, in the early stage, kind of the first cut, we're looking for important jobs to be done by people out in the market. And what I mean by that is you've got a customer out there who is raising their hand saying, I have this problem, or I have a need that I need solved. I don't have a good solution for. And it's a problem that either a lot of people have and are willing to pay a little bit to solve, or a few people have and are willing to pay a ton of money to solve. We're looking for big market opportunities. Our hope is that we can build businesses ultimately that come out of Sprint Week that we believe could have a path to significant market share in big and growing markets. So we need these ideas to be important, problems to be important for customers, meaning big dollar opportunities behind the problems.
Great. And speaking of ideas, I think Katie put in our chat window the website for Varsity Venture Studio. So if you want more information on the studio, please go to the website. And if you're a student, faculty, or staff member at UW-Madison, you can certainly, this is where we're collecting ideas. And we've been collecting ideas now for about 2 weeks. So thank you for all of you that have already submitted your ideas. We're going through that first batch right now and have come across some really, really good ideas that I think are pretty promising. One of the questions we got here is, can a venture studio be used to commercialize technology that's not software? And I also want to talk about, Elliot, get your thoughts on the studio at UW-Madison isn't necessarily just focused on SaaS. That's software as a service. That's certainly where High Alpha's experience is. But the studio at UW-Madison is taking a bit of a broader look. So if you can talk about, one, the broad question around, can studios do commercialize technology beyond software, and then specifically your thoughts on what we're looking for at UW-Madison.
Yeah, studios certainly can be used to turn ideas beyond software into new businesses, and we see the model deploy successfully, particularly in life sciences. Right now, you've got it's pretty well proven in life sciences. You've got some big, essentially studios out in the market like Flagship Pioneering that have been doing it at significant scale. Some people I know just launched a new startup out of a life sciences venture studio with an initial investment of $50 million out of the gates. Now that's an entirely different scale than we deal with in B2B software, which is part of why we like B2B software. It's easy to get those businesses launched in the market. And we know the metrics you can use to generate pretty significant value and to do so quickly. But the model works for lots of different types of technology. There are hard tech venture studios, life sciences venture studios, and so on.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning, the Varsity Venture Studio this year is a pilot for us. We're testing the model, answering some key questions and assumptions we've made about, can this model work on a campus, if fully deployed with a dedicated studio. And I think we decided to focus on software because that's where the model has been most proven, especially with the level of investment we could make in a studio for this pilot. But certainly, me personally, I would love to see opportunities for cohorts or at least ideas that would be outside of software at some point, but that's for sometime down the line. Kieran, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Steve had a question here in Q&A around the vetting of ideas. And I'll tee it up, Elliot, but then please give us your more detailed thoughts. But look, the ideas need to be venture backable, and then that itself is a very specific thing. So from my days in venture investing, you see lots of really good ideas that will make really good businesses, but they're just not going to happen on the time scale that a venture capital investment firm needs to see. So they're not that scalable. You'll also see plenty of decent ideas, but they're not addressing a hair on fire problem, as we say at D2P, and as you'll hear in anyone who's done the NSF Psycore, right? So it's got to be a certain combination of these attributes. It's not that there are all good ideas could get funded by VC, absolutely not. And it's not that all ideas that get funded by VC are good either, but they have to hit at least a certain, they need to tick a few of those boxes. So Elliot, maybe you want to answer that one there as well.
Yeah,
well
said.
The vetting of ideas.
In our core studio, we're looking specifically for opportunities that we believe could get to 100 million in revenue within 5 to 8 years. So think about businesses that are going into big and growing markets, maybe billion-dollar markets where you can go get 10% market share after a few years is another way to think about it.
Yeah. So one question that I want to make sure we hit, it's both a kind of a beginning question and end question, is can you talk about the ideas, the intellectual property, and then how does equity work for somebody who comes into a studio? What does that look like if they make it through the whole process? You talk about IP and equity and ownership in the ultimate company.
Yeah, good question. Kick me under the table here, Greg, if I misstep on the IP issue because it gets thorny. But the way that we think about it is you need for a business to be successful, and Kieran alluded to this earlier too, you need an idea initially. You need the people to make the business happen. You need customers, you need capital, a lot of different components. You think about partnering up with a venture studio. Think about the venture studio as an entrepreneur. Think about the venture studio as a co-founder. And what you want to think about is if I were to go launch a business tomorrow with a partner who came with the capital, who provided a good chunk of the work that needed to be done, and who may have at least helped significantly shape the idea in the beginning, you'd expect that partner to have a pretty significant equity stake in the business. Now, the equity piece is flexible to a degree. And what you see out in the wild kind of with venture studios is a pretty broad range of equity splits, depending on the level of support that a venture studio might provide. So the easiest way, I know it's not totally satisfactory, the easiest way to answer that question is the equity split depends on the level of support that a studio is going to provide after that business launches. Now, in most venture studios, what you see is that the co-founder, the entrepreneur, the CEO, and founding team who are building that business with a venture studio generally have anywhere from say 20 to 40 to 50% of the equity after the initial funding is done. And so it depends on the support of the studio. That's maybe a more specific answer, but the true answer is it depends. The way that we think
Right.
about IP in this setting is in the beginning, especially as it relates to software businesses, is that there often isn't a lot to patent or protect in the early days. This is where, Greg, you kicked me under the table because it gets, like I said, gets tricky on university campuses. When we're building software businesses, we're moving pretty quickly. We're not stopping to file patents or things like that along the way. It's not useful as an activity.
Right. I'm going to weigh in here as well, because like this is a conversation I have an awful lot on campus with innovators that come to D2P. And sometimes it's a company, they've already started a company or they're starting a company and wonder how to divide up the equity there. And one of the key things I always say is think about going forward. Think about who's going to be putting the work in. Think about the effort required. Think about who's going to stick around. I think, look, it's very common in an academic environment, but even within large companies where you have the technologists who think the technology is everything. It's the idea. I had the idea, and that's what it all is. I think we always just need to remember that the idea is just the first step as you climb a very big and very tall, very challenging mountain. So one of the great things I think with the studio is there's going to be options for the idea generators to be involved as well. And I think that's a discussion and a negotiation around how much they can and want to be involved. So it's not just about the idea generation, it's about the work that you do on that idea as well.
It takes a lot of people and a lot of work to make a company successful.
Yeah, and we have some ideas in the pipeline that have disclosures and intellectual property associated with them, so that's fine. But IP is not required to participate in a studio. I would be remiss if I did not say that if you're a faculty on campus, we do have disclosure policies that we need to follow still, but it is not that disclosure or there is no need to have intellectual property to come in to participate in the studio.
Time, Greg, we're getting close to the hour here, and there was a few questions on timeline actually. So I think they have been addressed written, but maybe it might be just to kind of flag to people the overall timeline for Varsity Venture Studio.
Sure. So through say Thanksgiving, we are collecting the ideas. There's more information on our website, but we're collecting it in 3 rolling tranches basically. So we'll be assessing those ideas with the studio team. We will be getting back to everybody with next steps. Then from winter to, after Thanksgiving to, January, February, we'll be doing a lot more exploration on those down selected ideas. So let's say we start from 200 ideas. We'd like to get 15 to 20 that are being further explored. And from those 15 to 20, we would take 3 to 5 through our launch week activity, which will happen sometime in April. So we are, given the current, pandemic, we're maintaining a very flexible timeline, but generally speaking, we're collecting ideas now. Early winter, we will be exploring, those 15 to 20, and then we'll be launching, hopefully, a company in the spring.
Right. And I mean, we've had a few other questions that have come in that have been kind of, we've answered by written answer, but a lot of them have been around, the idea and the equity and so on as well. Those are complicated conversations. I think I did put in one of my answers, hey, everything's negotiable, but maybe Elliot doesn't want to hear me say that. But feel free to follow up with any of us or with Katie Rice at WARF as well, in terms of further questions that you may have around that specific topic.
And to be clear, the idea is there is no ownership of the idea until the equity discussion really gets formalized before we kind of get into launch week. Is that correct? That's correct, Elliot, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That gets all ironed out.
That's correct.
So, all right. So I see Laura. So I'm going to wrap this up, and I want to thank Elliot for introducing us to the studio model. Again, please go to the Varsity Venture Studio website, where you can find out more information. You can find some contact information, and feel free to send us an email if you want to follow up. But again, I want to thank Elliot and Kieran, and certainly really appreciate the support of the university, especially D2P and High Alpha Innovation for helping us bring this pilot to campus. We're really excited to see at least one company get launched this spring through this effort. So, and thanks, Laura, for providing us this platform to introduce the concept to our ecosystem.
Great, thanks so much, everybody. And very quickly, go to warf.org if you want to catch any of the remaining WARF-funded, WARF-sponsored events for UW-Madison Startup Week, or innovate at wis.edu for the rest of the sessions this coming week. Thanks so much, everybody. Be well. Talk to you later.